And good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Burrows, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. We are meeting tonight for this Ask Us Anything webinar, and we are joined by the former White House drug czar, Jim Carroll, as well as John Shinholser, President of the McShin Foundation. Mac Haddow, our Senior Fellow on Public Policy, and I will be moderating the event. The Q&A is now open, and I will turn it over to Mac for additional opening remarks.
Thank you, Ryan, and welcome to all of you. These are pretty exciting times for us in the Kratom community. Just in the last couple of months, I was invited to travel to a number of areas where we were looking at potential issues related to Kratom, like the Czech Republic, where there was a ban proposed. And it was, by the way, and not surprisingly, heavily influenced by information provided by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to the Minister of Health there in the Czech Republic. It was false information, which is consistent with the FDA's narrative about Kratom. And following the conclusion of the conference that I was privileged to participate in, the decision was made by the Czech Republic to rescind any ban effort and to look to regulate Kratom under a very unique process that will allow for consumer access to Kratom in the Czech Republic. I also had the opportunity with a number of other colleagues to travel to Indonesia, where we had the ability to interact with the highest levels of the Indonesian government that was hosted by the president's chief of staff, Mr. Muldoko, and a presentation was made by the BNN in Indonesia, which has been the agency that has been heavily advocating over the past couple of years for banning Kratom in the country of Indonesia. And at the conclusion of their remarks, again, heavily relying upon the FDA's narrative about Kratom, and they openly disclosed that. Mr. Muldoko informed them that the president of Indonesia is fully supportive of Kratom farmers and wants it to become a valuable trade export from the country of Indonesia, and he would not be entertaining a ban on Kratom. Just last week, I had the opportunity to travel to Thailand to the first international conference on Kratom, which was co-joined with the drug development conference that is typically held at that location. And there they talked about how Thailand had rescinded their ban on Kratom that had been in place for decades. All of that illustrates that science drives decisions that allow for government entities to evaluate the potential harm reduction value of Kratom, the economic opportunities that are available, where consumers are speaking loudly with their pocketbooks. And we know that the safety profile of Kratom is one that, if it's viewed responsibly by policymakers, then we get into a regulatory environment that really does protect consumers and allows them the benefits of this magnificent plant. The outlier in all of this is the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, because even as all of this progress was being made, we had the FDA just announced in their publication on their website, FDA and Kratom, where they literally have taken the position, even though the law requires them to go through comment and rulemaking, they arbitrarily abuse their authority and claim that all product forms of Kratom are adulterated and therefore illegal for sale in the United States. We face this threat because you have an FDA that's frustrated because they're unable to bully their way into banning Kratom. They're losing their audience because they know that they were initially successful in jawboning states to ban Kratom. They got 6 to do it, and they see they're losing in those state areas, and they're also losing internationally. All of that speaks volumes to how science should drive this. We are privileged this evening to have as guest here on this webinar, Jim Carroll, the former drug czar in the White House, who was at the epicenter of the decision that was made in 2018 by Dr. Zawa, the Assistant Secretary for Health at the Department of Health and Human Services, where he made a thorough evaluation of the evidence and data that had been presented by the FDA supporting their application for the scheduling of Kratom. And he rejected that in a scathing letter that was characterized in a Twitter exchange between Dr. Gottlieb, then the commissioner of the FDA, and Dr. Zawa, where he called it embarrassingly poor evidence and data and a failure to consider the overall public health. And Jim was in the middle of that as the drug czar in the White House as that evaluation was made. We also have John Shinholser. John is well recognized around the United States as one of the leading experts on addiction recovery. And he and his wife were the leading founders of the McShin Foundation, one of the largest nonprofit addiction recovery programs in the state of Virginia. And his work there, of course, has been recognized around the country in this community as being one of the leading drivers for harm reduction therapies and availability of these programs for people that are struggling with addictions. And we think it's great to have both of them there. I'm going to invite Jim to give an opening statement, and then followed by John. And then we're going to open it up, as we said, for you can ask these guys anything that you want, and we'll work to make sure that all of those questions are answered. So Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mac, and thank you, Ryan, and for inviting me to participate in tonight's conversation. And it's always fun to be with John, and so I'm looking forward to answering questions from really around the world. As we kick off, though, we know Florida looks like it's about to get hit. So for any of our folks down there with friends or family, we're certainly thinking about you and hope everything goes well down in Florida. As Max said, I was at the epicenter when this issue came up in 2018, and FDA came and really unilaterally tried to ban Kratom. They first came to my office and presented as Dr. Jawah said, an incomplete picture of the facts that were out there. And they made it seem that it was a product for which there was no redeeming quality. And they also made it, that all of the products, everything in there was in fact dangerous, all of which we now know is true. Shortly after the meeting was over, I spoke to my close colleague over at HHS, Dr. Brett Jawah, a wonderful physician, a great guy. And when he found out about the FDA meeting, what I told him was they're headed next to the DEA. And they were, in fact, going to meet with the DEA administrator to get his signature, because it's the DEA administrator's signature that is required for the ban to take effect. And when I told Dr. Jawah where that Odom was at the airport, I remember this pretty clearly. It was one of the more unusual things at the White House, which is saying quite a bit, I think, these days. But and Brett hung up the phone, dashed to the airport, and pulled the administrator of the DEA into a meeting and said, "Don't sign it. We need to present the entire facts to you." Ultimately, of course, all of the facts were presented, and the FDA ban was quickly shot down because, in fact, they're missing a lot of the story. There were adulterants that were being placed in Kratom, which is exactly the goal of the American Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which is to make sure that Kratom is properly marked and make sure that it is free from any contaminants, that there is proper labeling on it, and of course that it's kept out of the hands of anyone under the age of 21. More importantly, and I think this is something where John and I both share a fundamental belief, is that right now in our country, we have an estimated 20 million people who are suffering from addiction. Sadly, we're losing someone in our country every 5 minutes to a fatal overdose, a fatal poisoning, when they don't really even understand sometimes the product that they are taking. It's not just what I've seen with my own eyes. I rely on Dr. Nora Volkoff, who runs the National Institute for Drug Abuse at HHS. Not only is she there currently under President Biden, she's been there for the last 4 presidents serving in that capacity. And she testified in front of Congress, do not ban Kratom, that it shows great potential for helping people with addiction. It helps actually get them off an opioid. It is not an opioid. And certainly there's a lot of science out there that proves it's not an opioid. The thing that really makes it effective for people with an opioid addiction is that it works in the same part of the brain, the same receptors in the brain, but it's not an opioid. And an independent study by Johns Hopkins, it was not commissioned by the American Kratom Association, showed that 87% of people felt relief from the withdrawal symptoms by using Kratom. And so the goal is to make sure that Kratom is allowed to be researched, that it's able to be accessed safely by people who need it, and that it's something that people understand that should be consumed in a safe way, which means exactly what the Consumer Protection Act for Kratom is trying to do. And so it's great to be here, as I said, and I'm looking forward to tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Jim. John, we'll turn it to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mac. Good to see you, Jim and Ryan. And it's always a pleasure to be with you guys and discuss this topic. For those that don't know me, I'm John Shinholser. I'm the co-founder of the McShin Foundation, president emeritus, and now I just work here as a senior peer. I'm also an old timer in recovery. I've been clean and sober over 41 years. So I've been around this space a long time. Yeah, that's a long time, Jim. And, you know, Kratom came on our radar 6-7 years ago. And what I noticed was a lot of kids were using, I say kids, they could be any age, but they, you know, we drug test and we had these kids doing fabulous. And Kratom we test them and we go, what is this stuff? So I went and got educated on what Kratom is. And what I noticed was these guys are using Kratom, you know, as a tool to level them off and act right in recovery. So I didn't see a lot of problem with it. And then a little later on, I became aware that, man, people can use this to alleviate the pain associated with opiate detox. So I did some technical assistant work with this neighbor recovery organization, and they took 30 opiate addicts. This is 6 years ago, I believe, offered them a week in a sober house, give them, you know, Kratom, and get them through the pain associated with detoxing from opiates. And 29 out of 30 successfully did this. And I'm thinking, why doesn't the whole world know about this? And now another little caveat, I've been going around the country doing peer leadership support training and doing a peer coach training. And after a while, I started seeing these people taking this training that were in recovery, and they would reveal that, yeah, I take Kratom, and, you know, instead of doing either Suboxone or Adderall or Methadone, you know, I take 4 grams a day, and it works for me. So I'm thinking, holy smoke, man, here's a supplement, something you can legally purchase. Why aren't people advertising this? Now, this is the good news about it. Then some of the bad news might be, because I'm in the addiction space, you know, I'll see some people in recovery. Now, keep in mind, a lot of people in recovery, they don't want to take responsibility per se for their recovery. They're always looking for something to fix them. And you know, some of these kids would go find Kratom, and the next thing you know, they'd be abusing it, you know, just like they would any other drug. And you know, I've seen some of them come back in recovery, and I've never seen a person not be able to get off of Kratom if they wanted to. And one of the horror stories I hear is how, you know, once I got involved with you, Mac, and I saw where the problem lays, and I got to thinking, holy smoke, this is a case where government, law enforcement, they don't like this because they lose control of funding, I'm thinking. And as you know, I've spoken in 46 different states in jails and prisons, and I've never yet seen somebody in jail or prison for either selling Kratom or being there for Kratom. And I guess these are the states where I've been where it wasn't banned. So I'm thinking, here we are in the middle of an opioid epidemic. All this great science is coming out. These great leaders are talking about it, but yet there's still that stigma associated with it. And that I don't know what you call it that the FDA is doing or the DEA wants to do, but the way I see it, they got this 100% wrong. And the more I'm engaged, the more I'm involved, the more excited I am to be part of this team and help not only reduce the stigma, but educate people. And when I found out about that Kratom Consumer Protection Act, I'm thinking, you know, light bulb goes off. This is exactly what the country needs. And as you know, I listen to people all over the country, and anybody that's distributing Kratom that doesn't get on board with this, I think they're helping fuel that stigma. And I'm not, calling them bad or anything, but as a nation, as these distributors go, the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, this is the solution to not only rapidly destigmatize this, but educating people. And let's get America where we need to be. And, that's one of my goals here. So that's a mouthful, but like you, Mac, I want to hear what the folks got to say and ask. Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you, John. And for those of you that want to ask questions, you can do it in the Q&A section. That's the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those. First question is one that is really interesting with a tragic consequence to it. And that is the description by Sherry that her daughter was arrested last week in Arkansas for having 11 grams of Kratom in her vehicle. She was moving from Texas, didn't even realize it was in her stuff. They charged her with possession of a controlled substance, excluding meth and cocaine. Any advice on how we should handle this? Sherry, first, you need to reach out to me tomorrow. Send me an email, mhaddow1 at, you can do it at mhaddow@americankratom.org. And we can talk about this, but you need to get a good attorney immediately for your daughter. Arkansas is one of the toughest states. There was an arrest that was made there several months ago where a tragic consequence was a conviction that led to a 10-year prison term, which is the minimum that can be given under the statute in Arkansas. Sadly, that individual was killed in a prison incident and never would have been there but for this horrible law. The good news on the horizon is that the states that have banned Kratom, and Arkansas is one of them, are actively looking at taking most of those 6 states, 5 of them, are actively looking at removing these bans. Vermont has already done it, so there are only 5 left. Rhode Island, Wisconsin, Indiana are actively in the legislative process to do it. And Arkansas, even though they only meet every other year, did approve legislation, which is fantastic, which will be reviewed by their interim committee in January of 2024 that will remove that ban and replace it with a KCPA. But that's not going to provide relief for your daughter. So please reach out, and we can certainly help the attorney that is involved in this case once you've retained one to help defend your daughter. We think this is really important. Second question, and this is for you, John. I assume this is a friend. Jeff Reagan said, "Hey, John, how long do you usually let a client, open quote, clean up, unquote, before you introduce Kratom? When I was at my worst, I had to clean up a little before I could tell that it was helping."
Well, I think the short answer is, it's a tricky spot here to be discussing some of this stuff because I don't want to misinform anybody. But opiates, I think that's a great tool to use pretty much immediately. I've known many, like alcoholics, right after they quit with the shakes or during the process of detoxing, they would start consuming this, to help them relieve the detox from alcohol. And then a ton of meth addicts, I really think right away. I mean, why delay? But you want to integrate an open-minded physician when you do this, as far as the detox part goes. And then, after that, it's once you detox, it's just responsible adult consumption at that point. Find your sweet spot. And I recommend people stick by that sweet spot, try not to increase it. And I haven't heard you guys talk about this much, but one thing I learned in my cannabis college courses I'm taking on cannabis, they say every so many months, take a few days off to try to re-regulate your brain. They say that with cannabis, and I'm thinking, well, hell, that might be good for Kratom too. I don't know, but I don't think that's another area we do need more studies and data and science on. That's why I'm excited about all these new studies coming out, because it's a frontier out there on science to come on this. I hope that was helpful, Jeff.
Hey, yeah, John, this is Jim. I was thinking what you said makes perfect sense, and about why we don't want a complete ban on this. That we need to be able to research it to be able to answer questions just like this, so that consumers understand, treatment professionals understand, what's in the best interest of the individual. And we're not the only ones. The president signed the national defense, the budget last year, I guess it is now, the end of last year, that called for more research. The current secretary of HHS, Becerra, called for more research on Kratom. And I think it's to answer these questions so that people can really find out, what is the best way, if they want to use this product. One, is it safe? And then 2, is it, at what, how should we consume this? How should we take this in that environment?
Another caveat is that many times I've been at my 12-step meeting at night, and these kids come in, they're shaking, they're detoxing. I say, man, just, go find some Kratom. That should hold you over until you can get in front of a provider And now you would think the providers would be happy about this, that we're trying to make that link. And Jim, you just mentioned, I know in those KCPS states, the kratom will be, properly tested, packaged, unadulterated. Those are the states where you don't have to worry so much, what's in it and that type of stuff. So a lot of good promise here.
So Jim, that leads to the next question that I'll ask you to answer from one of our attendees. What are the driving factors that motivate the FDA and other agencies to attempt to ban kratom? Is there any monetary incentive similar to the bans on cannabis?
It's a great question, and there's not a precise answer for this. It's something that, we've been trying to consider really since 2018 when the FDA tried to do this. I think that, quite frankly, I don't think that I've never seen any evidence of, that there is a monetary incentive for them to ban it. I think they're concerned about a reputational hit. I think that institutionally, that they are very concerned about allowing any product that doesn't come from a traditional pharmaceutical manufacturer to move forward. And, Mac, do you remember back the Food and Drug Administration, I guess it's been 20 years now, that they tried similar acts on some of the, the vitamins and some of the other stuff you can, buy at the drugstore or, at the GNC, vitamin store, that they were attempting to regulate. They overreached their legal authority. And again, I don't think it's that, that there were, some big payoffs as much as it is they're not wired to examine products like this. Mac, was that 20 years ago for the
1994 was the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, when Congress had to rein in the overreach by the FDA, where they wanted to ban all dietary supplements and vitamins and force them into the sieve of the new drug application process. So absolutely right. Your recollection.
I'm dating myself. Wow. Time goes by fast.
So the next question, and I'll handle this one and then invite both of you to make any comment that's appropriate. Sally asks, what do you propose for educating users that this drug, when abused, has risks and harms? And have you learned from marijuana promotion that promoting kratom use will increase youth use and risk and harms? So Sally, I'll tell you this, and I want to be respectful and welcome to this forum. We have no problem with critics being here. It is a very difficult thing to conflate marijuana, which is a scheduled substance, with kratom, which does not meet the scientific criteria required under the Controlled Substances Act in order to be scheduled. And the reason for scheduling, if you look at the 8 factors that are required for the evaluation of any substance being scheduled, are very specific, and it requires rigorous review. And that review has been conducted twice with respect to the FDA's recommendation for scheduling of kratom by U.S. agencies, and it's been reviewed by a group called the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, 12 international independent experts who determined that there was insufficient evidence to put kratom into the schedule criteria under international law, of which we're a treaty partner in the United States. And the significance of that is that if it could be scheduled, as marijuana is, it would be, but it's not. Now, with respect to the question about what have we learned about it, I am very concerned that any child who has access to a kratom product should have parental supervision at a minimum, and it really shouldn't be available to them at all, because I don't think children are in a position independently to make decisions about consumption of kratom until they're at least 18 years old to make this decision. And certainly a parent can intervene, because there are circumstances where teenagers get involved with drug abuse where kratom could potentially be of a benefit, but it would have to be carefully selected. But I think you can't learn about marijuana promotion, promoting kratom use, increasing youth use, because there are self-limiting factors that are associated with kratom products that do not make it appealing to children. And let me emphasize this: there is no scientific evidence, no survey data that shows that kratom is being abused by children. And that self-limiting thing that I talked about is its taste. If a kid wants to experience a euphoric high, they can go down to the corner and they can buy a substance that will provide that much cheaper than they could get for a kratom, and they won't experience the kinds of bitter taste and the gastrointestinal effects of over-consuming a kratom product, which will make them actually vomit it up. So I'm sorry, I don't see the correlation. And as much as some of the critics would like it to apply to kratom, it simply does not. Now, having said all of that, I'm for good labeling. I absolutely believe, in the American Kratom Association supports that the FDA should regulate kratom so that it is not available to children, and that when it is available to adults, that they have adequate information about its uses and how it should be consumed, including information about what's in the product and what the recommended serving sizes are for that package. That speaks to responsible regulation. But I'll emphasize, kratom is not marijuana. It is not a scheduled substance. And under current law, despite overly aggressive efforts by the FDA, they can't prove that case. And so I guess that's the bottom line answer. We share something that's important and a concern for the safety of our children. I'm as concerned as you are about that. And we certainly want to make sure that they don't have access without some kind of responsible utilization of it. And this is the important thing. What we're most concerned about is adulterated kratom products. I'll point to two examples that you've read about in the last couple of weeks. One is the uncontested judgment in Florida for the consumption of a kratom product that was called space dust. And in that case, the court awarded the family of the deceased individual that award because the kratom vendor didn't show up, nor should he have, because that product was a plastic bag where someone had taken a Sharpie and written on it space dust, and you turn it over and there is nothing on the back, no labeling, no directions for use. This was an adulterated product by every definition, and by its own marketing, the manufacturer claimed that it was a super potent kratom extract. The FDA, if they were doing their job, would not have allowed that product to be on the market. And that's a fact. And if anybody's looking for a responsible party in this, it's the FDA. And you ask yourself, why don't the trial attorneys that are exploiting these families that have had these tragedies occur, why don't they go to the FDA? Well, that answer is simple. There's no money there. The second case involved a Washington case where there was a $2.5 million judgment. And some people like to say, oh, well, that's proof positive that kratom is lethal. It is not. Because if you look at that case, you find that what the court determined was that the vendor that supplied the kratom that was purchased by the decedent had failed to, in their absolute duty, to properly warn through labeling what the consumption of kratom might lead to. There was never an evaluation of the toxicity of kratom, only the fact that the vendor had published an ebook which claimed that kratom could help with alcoholism and drug addictions. That's an illegal therapeutic claim. And again, if the FDA had been doing their job, which they are not, that product wouldn't have been on the market. And that's what we advocate for: good, responsible regulation that can only, and by the way, responsible use that can only come if the FDA does their job. And we actively are trying to promote that. You've heard me say it before. We've submitted more than 80 complaints to the FDA over the last 3 years of kratom products that are being marketed by vendors for using illegal therapeutic claims. The FDA would obviously, because we know their position on kratom, would be aggressively prosecuting all 80 of those vendors. Do you know how many they are? 0. Not one prosecution in 3 years. The FDA is not serious about this. They want this industry to implode. And the tragic outcome of that is that families are being misled by opportunistic trial lawyers who want to exploit their tragedy and blame kratom when it's actually the FDA that's responsible for this, because these products wouldn't be on the market if the FDA were doing their job. So I'll stop there. I invite Jim or James, or John rather, to provide any information you'd like.
What I've seen is that here's the good, the bad, the ugly. Once you're abstinent in recovery, people, they don't want to accept recovery. They want to find some ways and means, I'm going to say, to get high. Kratom, to me, from what I can understand, has a very low high component to it. And, some addicts and alcoholics, they might find that. And then, the next thing you know, they're overindulging in it, and then they got a consumption problem. And I put that back to the mental illness addiction. But many people, many alcoholics and addicts, they will supplement and use kratom to alleviate some other situation they got. And those are the people I get my intel from and who I pay close attention to. So, I'm an abstinent-based recovery guy. I don't take anything. But I know one thing, if I ever get pain and an injury, and if a doctor wants to prescribe me an opiate, I will, try Kratom first to see what that's all about, my personal experience, so I can see. But the only reason I talked about cannabis was the downregulation in the brain. And that's something I learned in school. Everybody's body is a little bit different in how they react to supplements, let's say. So that's where the science piece comes and why we need more education there. But, and then another thing, we were on the news a few years back about kids using Kratom instead of fentanyl, and they act like they were substituting one for the other. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. What rock could you crawl out from under? Every time you touch an opiate off the street or fentanyl, you're messing with a contaminated drug supply that's gonna kill you sooner or later. And I've never seen nobody take Kratom and die, or I've never really heard about anybody in my area. So I think it's a no-brainer in that regard. I'd much rather see people on Kratom than fentanyl or opiates, or even a heavy alcoholic or a meth or a crack addict. So there's no comparison. Out of all the drugs that a person might want to abuse, Kratom is the lowest, most least dangerous of all of them, or supplement, I should call it. And I hope that helps.
What I was going to add is I do think it's a good question. And what we did see is action by the federal government. I guess this goes back about 4 years when vaping really sort of took off. 5 years, 6 years, I guess now. And there was a ban put on the vaping devices that are truly, being sold in candy flavors and things like that to children. And because there was really, the industry was not regulating itself, so the government took that action. The same should be true here. That Kratom should not be sold and marketed in a way that it's intended for children. There shouldn't be cartoon characters on there. It shouldn't be candy flavored, and it shouldn't be sold to minors. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's much like vaping. It was originally intended, to be a smoking cigarette, a smoking cessation device. People have also used it as an alternative to cigarettes. And there's menthol and things like that. And that's fine for an adult who, over the age of 21, they understand what they're doing, and it's not being marketed to children. The FDA understands that. There's now a loophole that some of the importers, primarily it's coming from China on the vaping, are these illegal disposable vaping devices that are being, disguised as highlighters. So they look like a kid's school supply, just a normal highlighter. But it's, candy flavors, and there's cartoon characters on it. That is exactly what the American Kratom Association is trying to prevent from happening, is they want there to be responsibility held against, these stores that are selling a product that is intended to entice children. And so I think of it the exact same way as the illegal disposable flavored vaping devices, that the FDA is just now going around to sending letters to some companies, but they have not taken any enforcement action against them either.
Thank you very much.
Speaking of vaping, when vaping became popular in England and UK, the smoking, the reduced smoking, they considered that a big win because smoking went way down. People switched to vape, and they still consider that's a great exchange of problems to have over there. So, and I think Kratom is a great potential exchange, is a problem when you're dealing with opiates. So much no-brainer stuff in here. Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
That's all right. No, and thanks to everyone again for joining us. You can ask your question by typing in the question and answer period. We may not get to all of them tonight, but we'll answer them because we'll save the chat. And Ryan, if I'm wrong on that, you need to tell me, but our plan would be to answer those that we don't get to. We'll go to Heidi's comment or question. She said, I'm in Florida. I love our governor, but I'm wondering if other states are kind of saying they adopted the KCPA, but changing it to fit their needs and wants. We have the Florida KCPA that says minors cannot buy Kratom, but nobody is required to ensure it is clean, unadulterated with heavy metals and so forth. Excuse me, that's a great comment. And it illustrates the problem in working with legislators. We worked hard to get into this space where we had the KCPA framework in place, and certainly to protect children. But it was the Department of Agriculture that was upset that the legislature, in their view, over the last 5 years, had dumped upon them a number of unfunded mandates, and they tried to do their catch up on the backs of Kratom. And so that led to a robust discussion and a compromise. But the agreement was that the Department of Agriculture would work with us to develop the standards to make sure that we actually do the framework that protects against those adulterated products. And we're in the process of doing that. In fact, the Department of Agriculture just held a regulation meeting with vendors. And I think we're well on our way to make sure that we get this enacted next year through the legislature to do exactly what you've described, which is, of course, essential as we go forward with this. And so stay tuned for that. We're going to continue to work on it. And you know, the issue here in many cases is, well, why don't the states just ban it because the FDA wants to? And Florida was one of those states where there are a couple of legislators that raised that issue. The good news is that we're going against the ban craze, and we're using a good framework for Kratom regulations to assure, as Dr. Volko at the National Institute on Drug Abuse says, that people have access to a harm reduction tool for those that are struggling with these addictions where Kratom can help them. That's not what the majority of people use Kratom for, but it is one of the uses that obviously has tremendous benefits in this particular arena. So there's very little likelihood that you're going to see a state ban on Kratom. There hasn't been one since 2017, when Rhode Island was the last of 6 states to ban Kratom. And now, as I mentioned earlier, 5 of those 6 states are actively in the process of removing those bans, including Vermont, which already has, and they're in the rulemaking phase to do it. There is no scientific justification to ban Kratom, none. If there were, it would be banned on the federal level and internationally. So banning it is not the solution. That's a failed drug policy that goes back to criminalizing people. And it harks back to the sad case that the woman earlier asked about for her daughter, where she was arrested for having 11 grams of Kratom. There is a case in Alabama where there is a woman that's incarcerated and has been for months, where she had 200 grams purchased in Florida, thought she was still in Florida, got stopped in a DUI check in Alabama, and she was arrested and incarcerated. And that particular amount of Kratom was something that probably lasted for a month and a half. She thought she'd purchased legally. She thought she was allowed to have it. And here she is in jail. These are the kinds of failed drug policies that have created nothing but a mess in America, and we simply need to reverse that. And that's why I think we're going to be able to continue to do it. We have 11 states that have passed the KCPA. I think we're going to get many more next year because we've been working hard in those states in order to make it happen. So, Jim, you might want to comment on the drug policy of bans and the impacts they have on drug policy in America.
Yeah, it's a good question, and you know, this is one of those issues, and John talked about it at the beginning. So much of what is fueling this, I believe, is stigma. That there still is a stigma against people that are suffering from the disease of addiction. That they don't understand that this is a true medical condition. That it's not a moral failure, and so that in order to treat this like a medical condition, we want to make sure that we're giving them access to anything that can help them get off that addiction. And so, you know, the policy of an outright ban has not worked. I mean, we're looking at this now with, as I said, someone dying every 5 minutes, 300 people a day dying from an addiction, dying from a potential or dying from a fatal poisoning of a drug. So the ability, you know, to have a drug that we could research it, see exactly how it can help, in what format it could help, that we're not, you know, doing everything we can right now and making this a number one priority, I think is attributable to the stigma that is currently in our country.
Great. So Ward asked the question, do you think that the push to make it illegal is so pharma can sell it as a controlled substance? Also, I've been using it for around 8 years, and I admit that I'm addicted, much like people are addicted to coffee, alcohol, or other mildly addictive substances. I prefer the word dependence, but I understand the context. John, what's your view on that?
Well, you know, you look at the less of all evils on dependent products, and I would obviously say Kratom is the best way to go, but it's helping this fellow for so many years from a more dangerous, more harmful outcome dependence. So it's a win. And somebody asked a question earlier, what about homeless people? Should we give them Kratom? Look, I would, if I had my way, if your homelessness is a direct result of drug addiction, hell yeah, just like they go into communities and try to get people on Suboxone and methadone, I would definitely put Kratom on the menu in that content, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Laurie asked the question, any idea if we can get Kratom removed from convenience stores? The products being sold there are much stronger than Kratom. It's the biggest market for addiction, and convenience store clerks have resorted to shaming their customers to quit. Enhanced shots do not belong in these stores, including phony company information on labels, so that's not helpful for consumer use information. I'll take the first stab at this and then turn it over to my colleagues. First, Laurie, let me tell you that Dr. Volko made the point that there are people who are struggling with pain issues, acute and chronic pain, that have no alternatives because they can't get to addiction recovery centers, the stigma associated with them or the location of those. And that's why she wholeheartedly supports the availability and consumer access to Kratom. And that can happen in convenience stores and gas stations as well. And I know that people like to demonize Kratom and say, oh, it's sold in convenience stores. Now, I personally believe, and I think it's true in most states, it's the case, that Kratom should be behind the counter. It should not be something you just pluck off of the shelf. And there ought to be at least the consideration of doing it. If there's a store clerk that's resorted to shaming their customers to quit, that's a problem with the training of those convenience store clerks. It has nothing to do with Kratom. Now, the issue about extracts, this is a critical issue. If there is an extract shot that is so powerful that it induces euphoria, that's like a signature opioid, then that's an adulterated product. And that problem gets cleaned up with an adequate framework for regulation under the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. It is too easy to take shots at the extracts. Extracts are like coffee. When you buy a coffee product at Starbucks, it's an extract. And whether you like it or not, that's the fact. And the important factor here is that extracts should be made using FDA-approved food-grade solvents, so you do not enhance or synthetically increase the power of the alkaloids in Kratom. You can only increase the concentration at safe levels of a Kratom product. All have to be responsibly used, all have to be responsibly labeled, and they should have accurate manufacturing and contact information for any adverse event, as should every other dietary supplement sold in America. And certainly they should be serving size recommendations on those products to make sure that consumers are informed about the proper use of that product. That's the bottom line in terms of why we advocate so strongly for the KCPA. And those that want to ban it will use these kinds of arguments to say, oh, I've got a clerk that's that's selling to kids, and they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be. And they should be fined for it and penalized for it, the owner of the store. And we need to make sure that we clean up this system in terms of availability. But I'll turn it to Jim to see if he's got any comments on this as well.
No, I mean, I think that's, the issue is that it shouldn't be in a location where anyone, a child could pick this up, and anyone, under the age of 21 could come in there, and put it and take it for inappropriate use. And so, the idea of, I heard, it's funny though, I was thinking, Mac, back about some of the testimony that I've heard, in researching this. And as you might recall, this question came up once before, and I believe it was in Louisiana. And the response was from someone, who was battling opioid addiction and was using it for that purpose. And they were talking about selling in the convenience stores. And the response was it should be available anywhere. And that sort of mindset, speaks to, again, making sure that it's available for people that need it, that we're not cutting off access, we're not cutting off research, that we're in fact, allowing it for individuals who are adults who understand what they're doing, and that it is properly regulated and labeled.
That's great, spot on. So next question is, and this individual's Glenn, says, Mac, this is Glenn Shipe. I did the interview with the Mississippi news station where you were included as well. I'm hoping I did my part. I encourage others to do so. First, Glenn, thank you. We don't ask for special treatment. We only ask for fair treatment. And we don't ask for balanced treatment either. And I'll tell you why. If you simply repeat the FDA's lies about Kratom, and I know it's hard not to when you're doing a news story, but the FDA, it's not a balanced story when you tell a lie on one case And the FDA is clearly not telling the truth. And that's documented in Dr. Zwaz's letter, where he castigates them for the misinformation, their embarrassingly poor evidence and data, which they continue to repeat. That's balanced, but it's not fair. We ask reporters to be fair about Kratom and look critically at it, and we're grateful that you were willing to do that. So the next question is from Anthony. With all, and he supports my theory, with all the continuous lies that the FDA continues to publish, when and how can we publish the truth, and why can't we use some legal action? Jim, do you want to take a whack at that?
No, I mean, first off, we are a grassroots advocacy, group. We're not a bunch of lawyers, trying to take this on. What we're trying to do is convince people of the policy side. But Mac, what are your thoughts about how the AKA should be able, to set policy here? I think the best way to do it is through legislative action. That's the way that the government is supposed to work. And so that's, my view of how this should. But I'm interested here for you, Mac.
So I think it's a combination of responses. First is legislation, and we're working actively with the states to enact the Kratom Consumer Protection Act to protect consumers from adulterated products. Federal legislation will be filed shortly. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, a very conservative U.S. senator, and Senator Booker from New Jersey, very liberal member. On the House side, Congressman Mark Pocan, very liberal member from Wisconsin, and Congressman Jack Bergman, a very conservative Republican from the state of Michigan. And the illustration there is that this is not a partisan issue. This is about good policy. And that bill will require the FDA to regulate Kratom properly. It will remove the import alert, which is an abuse of their power, and it will require them to publish the kinds of standards that are required for, and we want them to be fair standards, for Kratom products to be manufactured and labeled and sold properly. So that's another thing we do. But in the interim, because legislation takes time, we're doing a couple of things at the AKA. First is that we're going to publish a website along with some other colleagues and friends in the dietary supplement industry, which will mirror what the FDA website, the FDA rumors website, which supposedly is to allow consumers to report disinformation by health websites that are not accurate. We want to report the FDA, and we want to report them to Congress, and we want to report them to the Federal Trade Commission about their disinformation that they're circulating about Kratom, because it's obvious that their embarrassingly poor evidence and data needs to be called out. So we're going to be doing that. We also are working hard with the Congress to have oversight letters that will be sent from the oversight subcommittees to the FDA to hold them accountable for their current actions. So this is going to require the support of the Kratom advocates to make sure that we hold the FDA accountable as best we can, to call them out when they make a mistake and where they're publishing disinformation, which the federal statutes really don't allow them to do. So we're going to hold them to account. So the next, the question is, the issue, and this is from Rhonda, the issue with Kratom is that along with other natural and herbal substances, it's non-patentable. The big pharma lobbying machine has a ridiculously large amount of money compared to the supplement industry. Let me tell you my impression of this first, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. I understand that money is the root of all evil, and we have to follow the money. And I'm more focused on the fact that the FDA receives a substantial amount of money for their drug development office through what's called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, where they collect money from Big Pharma in the applications that are filed for drug applications. And when it was first conceived, the target was to get 10% of that budget to be subsidized by the users of that drug development office. Today, it's 70% plus. And the truth of the matter is that the dietary supplement industry and the botanical supplement industry doesn't pay any user fees. So I think there's an embedded bias at the FDA where they want to follow that money and they want to collect money. And the best way to do that is to restrict dietary supplements and botanical supplements like Kratom and force them into the new drug application process where they collect a bonanza of money. I don't think, my personal opinion, that there's been much activity by Big Pharma, except for some companies, and there are exceptions to this, but most of them aren't concerned about Kratom right now because it is not patentable and there's really no marketplace for it as long as Kratom is legal in its natural plant form. Now, obviously, a chemically formulated, synthesized metrogenine and 7-hydroxymetrogenine combination could be very powerful, and it should, if it's synthesized in a chemical fashion that way, go through the new drug application process. And there is one company that's in the process of doing that. But I think it's more about the FDA's problem than it is about Big Pharma, in my opinion. So John, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I was still thinking about the convenience store comment, to be honest with you, because I took that cross-country trip earlier in the summer, and I took a kid with me. We drove to California and back. He got in a car strung out on meth and coming off alcohol. And thank God they had convenience stores all the way across country. So every state we went to, we could find some Kratom for this guy so he could, make the trip safely. He was actually fully detoxed by the time we got back. So another case there. But the question, what was the question again?
So the question is whether you have an opinion about whether Big Pharma really plays a major role in their influencing FDA on Kratom.
Did they play a major role in saying that OxyContin wasn't addicted and they could, pimp it out? Did they play a major role about Valium being the cure for alcoholism way back when? The FDA, what I come to realize about them is that, for better or worse, they do a good job on a lot of stuff, but man, they are terrible at a handful of things, and they are part of the problem. And I don't know why somebody doesn't sue them for they're trying to destroy the Kratom industry, and they're working in hand in glove with the criminal justice agencies, because the criminal justice agencies, to me, they looking for customers, indefinite supply of customers. And if you felonize Kratom, holy smoke, that's 15 million felons overnight. So yeah, I think there's some inbred and crazy stuff going on. So absolutely.
So John, Heidi writes this comment. John, I agree with you comparing this to cannabis, which has absolutely not been regulated well at all. John also talks about taking responsibility. Will all of you take responsibility for Kratom cannabis-induced delusions and psychosis and other negative health impacts?
Well, I never seen somebody on Kratom in a Kratom psychosis. I've heard about it. I've never seen it. But like you said earlier, they're two different substances. And I'd rather, I'm a plant-based believer and holistic healer believer and supplement believer. I think they should all be tried before any other pharma stuff. If they just practicing medicine with these pharma drugs on conditions, I'd go the old school route first before I do the new route. But I think they're two different substances.
Thank you. And Heidi, I would just comment that taking the emotion out of it, that the science proves that pure unadulterated Kratom does not induce delusions or psychosis. I don't disagree that someone who abuses Kratom, just like you abuse caffeine, for example, because it required the FDA. And by the way, caffeine is the most widely used drug in the world, but we still allow it to be used. And we know that there are people who abuse it and that they have negative health outcomes, but that's not the responsibility of the Kratom community, for example, to account for the abuse of Kratom by people that just simply cannot control themselves. But back to the point, if Kratom produced delusions and psychosis and other negative health impacts, it would be banned. That embarrassingly poor evidence and data, which you are relying upon, with all due respect, that the FDA is circulating, and I don't blame you for believing it. It's just that the FDA, promotes this kind of propaganda about Kratom and has misled people. They're the ones you should look closely at and evaluate that as best you can. So that's my recommendation on doing this. And I know we can disagree on this, and we should do so respectfully. But we can't just let the fact that the FDA told you something hold the day, because they've told so many people the same nonsense and it's been rejected, including at HHS, by the DEA, by the US Congress, by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. The lone wolf is the FDA, and they continue to propagate their disinformation about this.
Mac, another thing is I noticed when we go around the country, some of the fierce opposition is coming from Suboxone doctors. And I honestly believe they feel threatened by Kratom taking away potential business down the road. So, and they got the support of the FDA. I think that's crazy, because I remember when they rolled out buprenorphine 20 years ago, it was used as a taper product, not as a long-term replacement therapy. And then now the evidence to me is clear that Kratom is used as a replacement component for other pharmaceuticals. And I thought I heard somewhere where somebody that's using Kratom might take away 2 or 3 pharmaceutical products. And, you can do the math on that. So I think there's a team effort there to discredit Kratom.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this is one that probably, Jim, you're best positioned to handle. Derek says, the reason that so many people have turned to Kratom is because Trump made it so only 10 milligrams is the max you can get for pain. I'm assuming you're talking about oxycodone or opioids, unless you have cancer. So he put a lot of people at risk. I think a lot of people don't see this. Kratom is no different than coffee, has a little buzz to it, and then wears off. There is nothing wrong with the stuff. I believe the FDA needs to be defunded. There is stuff we put in our food that other countries ban because of health risks, but the FDA says it's okay. It all comes down to greed. So I'll turn it over to you.
All coming down to greed, Mac. I do think, what you said near the beginning, which is root of all evil, right? In this situation, opioids were overly being prescribed. I have a child that is in recovery from a dependence on opioids that started with a prescription to an opioid. And so, there was certainly a push to make sure that unnecessary opioids were not being distributed. And so, there was training and guidance given to prescribers, to doctors, to reduce the number of, high dose opioid prescriptions. The last thing that we would want to do, to anyone, especially, with chronic pain or severe pain, is not allow them access to opioids. Fentanyl's been around for 50 years. It's a great drug in the right setting. And I've had surgery and they've used fentanyl. And I've had it for pain. And so, no one is trying to ban, painkillers for those who need them. I think that what we're seeing is more and more use of Kratom as people are realizing the dangers, which is a good thing, of taking too many opioids. And so they're turning to alternatives. And as John said, a holistic alternative.
So Tom, who says he's a reporter in Hernando County, Florida, is Florida headed towards banning Kratom, and what can Floridians do to prevent it? I don't believe that Florida's legislature is headed towards a ban on Kratom. I think they're headed in the right direction. But as a former Senator Everett Dirksen said, that the Congress can do any damn fool thing it wants, and usually does about 10 seconds. So we're going to be on our guard to make sure that Florida stays on the path to properly regulating Kratom. And when we can convince the Department of Agriculture there that there's a good framework that can be effectively implemented without overburdening their budget, then I think we'll be in a good position. Next question is, great information. In Louisiana, much stigma is associated with Kratom, some horrible stories. How do we overcome? So Jim, you were down in Louisiana. You saw some of the testimony. What's your view on that?
Yeah, addiction is such a horrific disease. And, the people who are going through it need our prayer, but they also need our support and an understanding and the ability to make sure that they have access to great treatment. And one thing that John and Carroll understand at McShin is there's a big difference. In one of the terms that I really hate for dealing with people with addiction is, oh, we just need to put, head in a bed. That's awful. People need good treatment. They shouldn't be warehoused in the treatment facility that is subpar. And it needs to be individualized treatment. That's what McShin does. That's what, other reputable institutions do. And so what we're trying to do here is make sure that, people who have that addiction, we saw them testify, it was powerful testimony to say, I'm trying to save my life. I'm trying to be a, productive member of society, and Kratom, help me achieve that. And so, by passing the Consumer Protection Act for Kratom, the KCPA, what it does is make sure that the product is not adulterated, that it's in an appropriate form, that it's, again, not marketed to children, not sold to children, and that people really understand exactly what it is that they're taking. And so, I'm an advocate for people in recovery, as is John. And the last thing that, we would want to do is deprive them of, good research and good help that can get them back on the path.
So, John, I think one of the points that I've heard consistently in state legislatures is, and Nora Volkow says it, there's a stigma attached to getting addiction treatment. And that's why one of the reasons she's strongly supportive of Kratom being accessible to consumers, because otherwise they're not going to get treatment because of that stigma or because of the cost associated with seeking addiction recovery treatment. So what's your view on that issue? That's for you, John.
Oh, well, got my head spinning because, number one, think about this. As a harm reduction tool, as inexpensive as Kratom is, I can imagine engagement workers, peer support specialists going out in the community, striking up a conversation with the mass majority of people that won't ever be engaged in these most expensive treatment models that are 97% ineffective, and start going after that large population that's not even engaging and trying to get educated. And, Kratom could be a damn good tool for that, but advocating, see, it's not always comfortable to advocate. And I remember going down to Louisiana, sitting in some of those hearings with all those people that don't want to hear this, but they got to hear the truth. And the more of us that step up and step out and be a face and voice of reducing the stigma associated with Kratom, the more movement we're going to have. The treatment thing, oh my God, there's so much. It's all over the map. So I think plant-based products in the future are going to be a great segue into treatment, a lot less expensive, and you'll get a lot more open-minded people coming. Most of these people go to rehab, they don't want to give up everything. They just want to give up the drug that's caused them the most problem and the most consequences. So why does everything got to be all or nothing in these rehabs? And people are onto this MOUD. I mean, Suboxone is a great tool for the opiate addicts, but and if that's going to be their end game, so be it. But they should have alternatives, and I think Kratom is a perfect alternative for that. So this is an hour-long discussion on treatment, though, Mac, and I know we ain't got that much time. So
we don't, but thank you for encapsulating it. And I'll tell you just my observation. I've been in a number of states where I've heard from parents and loved ones who report to legislatures that they lost a loved one and they blame Kratom. And it's interesting the number of people who report behind those testimonials, and including law enforcement people who say that they have seen the autopsy reports and that there were other substances that were involved tragically in that death. And it just goes to the circumstances of the tragedies that people face in this world. And when they lose a loved one, they want to find someone to blame. And by the way, these trial attorneys exploit that and promise them the moon if they'll just focus on Kratom. And we think that every one of those families should hear the truth. And a medical examiner signing off on a death saying it was metrogenine intoxication doesn't mean that that's the truth, because we know that the science demonstrates that there is no toxic level of Kratom that's been identified, and always it involves either underlying health conditions or the use of other substances which contribute to the death. And sometimes it's just contraindicated products that they're taking that are prescribed by a physician that shouldn't be, that can contribute to those kinds of deaths. So these are tragic circumstances. We try to be as sympathetic as we can, but the truth is what counts in these kind of circumstances. Next question, actually a comment that I want to just repeat from Rhonda, and thank you for doing so. She says that she's 12 years sober and a chronic pain patient from a serious car accident that she had in 1986 as a teen. I am prescribed a low-dose opiate. By supplementing with Kratom, I've been on the same dose of opiates for 11 years and have not had to increase it. Kratom is valuable in that respect as well. That testimonial mirrors what I hear from hundreds and hundreds of Kratom consumers around the world. So thank you for sharing that, Rhonda, because it's obviously important. Ben asked the question, I'm going to encapsulate this one. What about the federal KCPA? Will it be the same as last year? It will be word for word the same, except for the title of the bill. It will be called the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act rather than the Kratom Clarity Act. And that will be sponsored, as I mentioned earlier, by Senator Lee, Senator Booker, Congressman Pocan, and Congressman Bergman, and it will have many, many other co-sponsors as we go forward. It's going to take a little while to get that bill passed, but it's the start in order to force the FDA to be accountable going forward. Then Sean says, John spoke of new research data being on the horizon, and I'm mistaken, or does Kratom seem to be the holy grail of pain medication if it is able to be amplified in a drug manufacturer's lab? Low level dependence, little to no effect on respiratory drive, and moderately effective for treatment of pain. It seems like it could be developed into something that could one day reduce opiate pain medications. Does anyone know if this is true or in the works? So, John, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I hope they hurry up and figure that one out. I mean, they're always looking for that magic pain pill that doesn't get you addicted or kill you. So I can see a bright future for Kratom in the pharma industry, but don't ever take away the supplement we can currently, buy today. And, years ago, sailors at sea used to eat citrus to keep from getting scurvy. Well, you can buy a lot of vitamin C products, and they actually make prescription vitamin C. So you got, yeah, I see a future in it, but don't take away the system we got now.
This is why research is so critical.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, Jim, Daniel asked, is there evidence that Kratom can be beneficial as a treatment for opioid addiction?
Well, the Johns Hopkins study, I would go back to that where, 87% of people felt relief, when using Kratom to get off opioids. And so the research is certainly out there. As I said, there's now been 2 bills signed by the president for additional research. And so, that's the research that, I would go and certainly you can find it online, or Mac, I'm sure you can make it available to them if someone wants to email, but the Johns Hopkins report is pretty clear.
And that study documented that almost 3,000 Kratom consumers using it to wean off of opioids, that not only did 87% report a reduction in the withdrawal symptoms, which is the hardest part of getting off of an opioid, 35% were opioid free within a year. That's the kind of evidence, and then it is repeated in hundreds of articles that have been published about the safety profile of Kratom, alluding to the fact that Kratom can be a valuable tool in reducing opioid use because of the pharmacologic effects of its alkaloids. And Dr. Chris McCurdy has done a number of studies funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse that documents exactly that. So absolutely, we're seeing very encouraging results for this kind of research that will demonstrate that Kratom can be this valuable harm reduction tool. John asked, what is the end game for the reason to ban Kratom? A prescription written by your doctor in order to access an excellent pain medication is that Kratom is. I think, I'm not sure I read that correct. What is the end game for the reason to ban Kratom? A prescription written by your doctor in order to access excellent pain medication that Kratom is. So the end game is convoluted. There are many people, well-intentioned, uninformed, that are following the FDA's propaganda and disinformation that believe that Kratom should be banned. And the truth is that they can't justify it at the federal level or the international level. They certainly can't do it at the state level. So I think that's clearly the position that we're in as we go forward. Robert asked, is it possible to grow Kratom in the United States, or does it grow only in Southeast Asia? Is it used in other countries besides the US? I covered this early on. Some of the parts of this where it is being used effectively in other countries. The truth is that Kratom grows because of the unique climate and soil conditions and water availability in South Asia. It grows ubiquitously. But what we're finding today is that Kratom can grow in similar tropical environments in Florida and in Hawaii. And we have a robust growing pattern that's developing there. And I think it will make a significant input into Kratom raw materials being available domestically as we go forward. So very encouraging stuff on that. The next question is from Derek. THC can give you a super big high. Kratom is nothing like it. I'm still clear-headed and I don't feel all high or gross on Kratom. I believe tobacco hits harder than Kratom ever will. So John, do you want to give us your impression of that? You've worked with people that struggle with this kind of thing.
Hey, Misty Brown caught me spitting out my nicotine pouches. I've been nicotine free 10 years once and 8 years another time. Nicotine's a son of a bitch. I don't know about Kratom because I ain't never took it or was dependent on it, but everybody I talk to, they say, the dependent folks, it's between maybe coffee and nicotine, worst case scenario. So, I hope that helps a little bit.
It does. Thank you. Robert, and I'm going to try to condense this a little bit. Does a DA understand that it is helping addiction? And secondly, do they understand that it's better than long-term opium-based prescriptions for long-term and terminal health problems? And he goes on to describe his own experience. The proof is in the pudding. The DEA rejected the FDA's petition for scheduling Kratom because it didn't have the evidence that is required. And that was transparently evident in the withdrawal notice that was published on October 13th of 2016, when they told the FDA they wanted them to, that there was insufficient evidence, they wanted them to supplement it. And the DEA has stood firm that they are not going to take the application from the FDA that is not properly framed with evidence and data that is acceptable on this. And so I think that the DEA is doing the right thing. Now, the DEA does have Kratom listed on their drugs of abuse because that is the adulterants that are happening, but they've never listed it in their report on the drug threat assessments that are made, because there is no signal that justifies, meaning a safety signal that justifies the inclusion of Kratom in any of the drug threat assessment reports that the DEA has issued. So I think the DEA is doing their job. They're surveilling it, but they're not acting on the FDA's disinformation about Kratom.
I would also add, Mac, that Kratom is not listed as an addictive substance in the DSM, the latest DSM, Diagnostic Statistic Manual, that's used by healthcare professionals. Alcohol's in there, cigarettes is in there, obviously opioids, marijuana. Kratom is not listed.
That's great. Silvana asked, good labeling, 21 plus, COAs, certificate of analysis for quality. AK supports these needs. What efforts are being made to educate the sellers? That's a great question. We have a program in place for vendors to voluntarily submit to our GMP program, Good Manufacturing Practices. We put that in place because the FDA is failing to do it. And we wanted consumers to be able to identify vendors who are committed to those standards that are available for botanical supplements, good labeling, which we've just added, and making sure that these vendors are acting responsibly in terms of the manufacturing practices. And they're required to submit to an independent third-party audit, which is the way that dietary supplements and botanical supplements are regulated by the FDA, because those independent auditors verify that they're meeting and compliant with the FDA regulations. So we're doing our best. We have about 3 dozen of those companies that have done it. There are probably 8,000 vendors in the United States of Kratom products. The majority of them, not all, but the majority of them should be put out of business because they're not manufacturing to good standards. They're not testing their products. They're not labeling them appropriately, and they're not submitting to the kind of GMP practices that are necessary. So there will be a shakeout in this industry when the federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act passes, which will direct the FDA to responsibly regulate Kratom, and that will lead to a real shakeout in this industry. And some of our critics say, oh, well, you're just trying to protect the big guys. No, I fully support the ability of a small business to get into the Kratom business as long as they do it right, as long as they're protecting consumers following the guidelines that are required under federal law. And if the FDA were doing their job today, and they're not, if they were, you'd be out of business right now if you're not willing to comply. So I think the shakeout will be companies will wake up and they'll have to comply, or they'll merge, or they'll just go out of business, which I think is fine if that's the choice that they make. Let me go to the next question. Would it be beneficial to discuss the benefits for Kratom for people who are not addicts or in recovery? The discussion is this only on opioid recovery tool adds stigma. Could it be an alternative to coffee? Now, I'll start and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. The consumer surveys conducted by the National Institute on Drug Abuse document that a third of Kratom consumers, of the 15 million that do it, use it as a cup of coffee replacement for the energy boost and the increased focus. Another third use it to boost their mood and to deal with symptoms of anxiety and depression. It's only a third that use it for this other area. And we're not trying to stigmatize it. The focus that we have on the people that are struggling with addictions is because that's where NIDA is. And that's the focus that the FDA has put on it, because they claim people are self-medicating with Kratom to get off of opioids. By the way, thank God they are, as opposed to staying on an opioid, which potentially has some addiction problems and safety issues with respect to overdose. So these are tough issues, but it's not what we promote in terms of the utilization pattern. The American people are speaking, and 2/3 of the American people use Kratom for things that are unrelated to opioid addiction. So John, I'll turn it to you for your response on that as well.
Well, it's funny you say that because Jeff, who's listening, he puts a scoop in his coffee every morning, and that's how he does his day. And I'm starting to see Kratom drinks, down here at the mini mart. So it's already coming. It's going to be probably a recreational, beverage, sooner or later. So I think there's a future for that, absolutely, and it should be, responsible consumption of a product.
So, Jim, do you have any comment on that?
No, I mean, I think that's just it. The issue for me is that it needs to be regulated, right? We want it to be available, but it has to be properly labeled. We have to know exactly what's in there, that there's no contaminants. And, for the purposes of NIDA, an agency that I oversaw when I was the U.S. Drug Czar, is making sure that we follow the advice of the experts, which is, keep research going on this because of the potential for drug addiction. Well, as to the other things, that's it's something for an adult to decide, with as long as they have the understanding and it's labeled correctly.
Good. We're in the last 15 minutes, a little less than 15 minutes that we're going to go. And so again, if we don't get your question, we'll try to answer it. If you don't hear from us, then certainly reach out to Ryan at americankratom.org or to myself. Justin asked an interesting question. And the reason I'm going to repeat this is because I'm learning about this as well. He says some of the potent extract shots, like, and he names a particular company, for example, contain upward of 2% 7-OH by volume. Pure leaf kratom has typically less than 0.3% 7-OH, and 7-OH is a trace alkaloid and is not prevalent in the natural form of the plant. How are these type of products not considered to be adulterated? When I say I'm learning about this, that when I started this journey about 6 years ago, I believed that 7-OH was in fact an alkaloid of the kratom plant. It is not. It is a metabolite that after harvesting, because of the natural drying of the leaves, occurs. I'm also learning, and this is pretty recent, that the standard that is being applied by some, including the KCPA standard we have, that you cannot have a kratom product that has a greater than 2% by fraction of the overall alkaloids in the plant, is illegal. The question, and I'm learning now that maybe that standard based on testing methodology is not as solid as it needs to be, and we need to examine it more closely. We've invited a group of lab testers that are experienced in this field to make a presentation at our next Kratom Summit that will be in Denver at the end of September. This is not a settled issue. But here's the important issue. When I consulted experts in this field, when we first started looking at what the limits should be in the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, what we were told is that anything above 2% was potentially harmful, but anything below 2% had no adverse health impacts on the kratom products themselves. And that's being borne out even in the current discussion we're having about what the appropriate level of 7-OH ought to be. So Justin, call me. I think we need to talk about this because I could give you some more detailed information that I think might be useful on this. It is the wrong message to demonize 7-OH because the truth is that 7-OH metabolizes in our liver, in our own bodies, and it is the substance that effectively has the therapeutic benefits to the extent they exist, as mild as they are with kratom. And I think we could have a robust discussion. So Justin, I welcome you calling me and we can have a discussion about that. The next question is, are there any surveys or clinical trials that can scientifically prove that kratom can help combat heroin addiction or other substance use disorders? If not, how come there isn't? I've personally seen dozens of people successfully detox from heroin and meth using kratom. Kratom is literally saving lives. John, we'll start with you.
Well, that's what we're seeing in our community. I live in a community of, there's probably 100,000 addicts in Richmond, Virginia, addicts and alcoholics, and I'm just seeing hundreds of them over the last few years. They go to kratom instead of this other stuff, and they're living happy, normal lives, and they don't have any impact or fallout. I see a handful of kids substituting one form of using for another. They have a problem with it, then they drop back and punch. So, and yeah, I do hear it. I do hear like McCurdy and John Hopkins continue to do studies in NIDA. So I think the future is going to be very promising on these studies. I would bet money on it if it was a place I could go gamble on it, and I don't gamble.
No, I agree. I think that we're going to continue to see more research. That's what has been called for by, President Biden in the budget, as I said, by the Secretary of HHS. And so I do think there's going to be research to the, as to why there hasn't been. I think it's the problem with the FDA. It's that the FDA, is spouting information that is not accurate. And so there might have been some reluctance to do the research that it really deserves.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we're seeing promising research that's going to continue to be done. But that ties into the next question from an anonymous attendee. Why won't the FDA or other academic institutions like Mayo, Hopkins, Duke do some peer-reviewed blind placebo studies so that there is a proper analysis of this and then properly create the necessary protections in consumer information? Well, let me say this. There has been a significant amount of information generated by well-qualified studies that the FDA and Mayo have ignored. I'll give you an example. There was a study that was done that it was called the oxycodone protocol, which was given to the scientists by the FDA. They know exactly what happens with the dosing of oxycodone, and they used that to measure the safety profile of Kratom. The FDA didn't like the result, which was that even at 400 times the amount of Kratom that any human could consume in a day, there were no deaths, and there was only sedation, which was expected at that high a dose. 400 times. When that was presented to the FDA, the scientists at the FDA at the table said, wow, that really changes our view of Kratom. The HHS employee who self-described himself as the death expert, who had actually done the analysis of the deaths that were reported in the scheduling recommendations in 2016 and 17 by the FDA, said, well, that would change my analysis of the deaths. And the FDA policy people said, meeting over. They closed down the meeting. The FDA is not interested in hearing the truth about Kratom. There have been studies. The Mayo Clinic was presented by a philanthropist who has a family member who was saved by Kratom, a blank check to do research on Kratom to test its safety. And the Mayo Clinic declined because they did not want to impair their relationship with the FDA. The FDA published an RFP, a request for proposals, 2 years ago to do a dose finding study and a human abuse potential study for Kratom. When I heard that, I was ecstatic because now we're going to get the FDA into the game. But there was a caveat. The FDA said that they would not allow any of the applicants for this grant to publish the data without the specific approval of the FDA. That is unprecedented in taxpayer funded research. And most of the legitimate and responsible educational institutions that do this kind of research declined because it was unethical. Even Commissioner Califf admitted when he came on board that he never would have approved that. 2 years later, has anyone heard about the results of the dose finding study or the human abuse potential study about Kratom? No, they've had plenty of time to get them done. They don't take 2 years. They haven't produced it because they don't like the results at the FDA. The FDA is biased. They demonstrate their bias daily. You can see it on their website. It's simply wrong what they're doing. And the only great news coming out of Washington is HHS disagrees with them. NIDA disagrees with them. The US Congress disagrees with them because of the science that's out there. I get a little amped up on this and I apologize, but Jim, you want to talk about, where the FDA is with their disinformation campaign as it comes to the development of policy on Kratom in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent my entire career here in DC, and the FDA is often the subject of criticism for failure to act. And I talked about the vaping earlier. There's a lot of criticism now because they're not going after these candy flavored disposable vapes that are being marketed to children. There's been a lot of news reporting on that, from parent advocates and from community members about why isn't the FDA doing more? And I think this is just another example where they are very slow to act. They don't understand the power that they have, but the responsibility they have to protect consumers. And so, sadly, I don't think we're not the only ones who are trying to stand up for those who are suffering from addiction. We're not the only ones that the FDA has left disappointed.
Thank you. So we're down to the last 4 minutes, and so we're not going to get to all these questions, but thanks for those who are participating. I want to give a little bit of equal time, and again, respectfully respond. Daniel says the Kratom industry is not responsible for abuse, ? The Sackler said the same thing. Careful information and supervision might be the answer. Daniel, there's one thing we agree on, and that is there ought to be supervision. There ought to be regulation. The Kratom industry is indeed responsible if they manufacture and market Kratom products that are not meeting good GMP standards, if they are marketing products that are not labeled properly, if they are marketing products that contain adulterated substances. Of course they're responsible. But who's responsible for holding an industry responsible for those standards? It's the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And who has abdicated that responsibility that's statutorily imposed on them? It's the FDA. And we've got the proof. We can speculate all day long about, well, what if we did this and what if we did that? What we do know is that the Congress has empowered the Food and Drug Administration with the responsibility of protecting the American public when it comes to dietary and botanical supplements, and the FDA has refused to do that job. They've refused to do it, and I can't overemphasize that. They want this industry to implode on itself. And in doing that, they're going to sacrifice the lives of people, and how many anguish and suffering of people of adverse events from poorly formulated or adulterated Kratom products. Someone's got to call an end to it. And thank goodness the Congress is now ready and poised to have the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act passed. And that provides a solution, and it will compel the FDA to do the job that they're supposed to be doing. So, Jim, I welcome any comment you might have on that as well.
No, I think, I know we're ending, so I think really, I'll end with a, sort of a parting remark, which is it's great to really have this dialogue and actually see, how people across the country and maybe across the world are, thinking about this issue. And I think that everyone is, in many ways, or most people are saying the same thing, which is the Kratom needs to be responsibly regulated, that it needs to be responsibly sold, but that it shouldn't be, left up to an agency that is just, stuck in the mud. And that, so, we're trying to force the FDA to take appropriate action. In the meantime, it's great to be with everyone, hear what's going on in some of these state legislatures, making sure that the KCPA gets passed. And also in those half a dozen states where the FDA was successful with their misinformation campaign, to try to get it overturned so that there can be appropriate research and appropriate use. So thank you very much, Mac, for allowing me to participate tonight.
Thank you. John, do you have any closing comments?
I'm a fierce warrior advocate. And I put my money where my mouth is, and my actions back up my beliefs. On September 22nd, I'll be with a bunch of people at the Department of Justice protesting not convicting the Sacklers for unleashing in the history of the world, the worst opiate epidemic. The people at AKA, you guys, and the people that help support AKA, y'all should get a Nobel Peace Prize. It's just black and white, night and day, the difference in that particular, question and whatever. But you guys are doing amazing. We're going to change the world, and I'm proud to be part of it. Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you, John. And I can tell you that the Kratom advocates that are hundreds of thousands of Kratom consumers who are willing to stand up and speak about Kratom are the true warriors and heroes in the Kratom effort around the country. I've been in dozens and dozens of hearings around the country where I've heard the heartfelt testimonies of people who say that Kratom has improved the quality of their life, allowed them to be functional in their lives, allowed them to restore them to being able to work and to be contributors to society, and how it saved their lives. And I know that there's a large number of people who, while they don't show up at many of them don't show up at hearings, they talk about how Kratom helps them as a replacement for these other substances that they otherwise would do. So there's not a perfect answer to any of this, but I can tell you that clearly the 15 plus million people who use Kratom in the United States are real people. Their voices deserve to be heard, and we're seeing success in the state legislatures around the country, really making a difference where legislators react to it. They get their noses out of their laptops where they're Googling Kratom, and they see all the negative stories because the FDA uses its power in the marketplace to drive all of those hits. But they're seeing the true testimonials of people. And I'll end with this as well. We reach out to those that feel like Kratom has been a negative thing in their lives. We want to regulate Kratom. You cannot ban it. So give up on that, because it's driven by science, not by my opinion, not by the opinion of the critics of Kratom, and not even by the opinions of some of the people that think they know it all. It is driven by a consensus of science, and the science today that exists in the current framework is 120 plus new articles since Dr. Joie called the FDA's case embarrassingly poor evidence and data. It's even stronger today that Kratom is helping people. So I thank all of the Kratom warriors. I respect those that are critics. I want to hopefully represent you in terms of putting good framework around regulations so that we don't have adverse events or deaths that are associated with adulterated Kratom products, or at least limit those as much as possible. But that's going to require the FDA stepping in as well. So the American Kratom Association is grateful. We appreciate all that have joined us here tonight. For those questions we didn't get to, please stand by for an answer, or email Ryan and he'll get it back to you. This is a battle that we all share a common goal, and that is to try to reduce the adverse events that are associated with adulterated Kratom products and find a good regulatory framework that protects consumers as best we can. So thanks to everyone for being here with us this evening, and stand by for this to be published tomorrow so that you can review it if you choose to do so and circulate it to your friends. So thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.